Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Now in this video I wanted to do something a bit different. In my previous videos I've tended to concentrate on medieval Britain with a particular emphasis on Wales and more recently the Wars of the Roses. But here I want to talk about another of my interests, which is the so-called Byzantine Empire. Now Byzantine or Byzantium are controversial terms because they were only invented much later, in the 16th century I think, but they basically describe the Eastern Roman Empire, which was the bit of the classical Roman Empire that was left after the West fell apart in the 5th century AD. The East, centred on Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, survived for another 1,000 years. And you had a great long line of emperors who considered themselves to be direct heirs to the classical emperors who started with Augustus, the Caesars, and their successors. As many of you will know, this empire consisted, albeit in a sort of slowly decaying form, right up until 1453, when the city of Constantinople itself, the capital of the ancient empire, which was pretty much all that remained of it by that stage, the mid-15th century, was taken by the Ottoman Turks and renamed Istanbul. And that was the end of the last fragment of the Roman Empire, because the people of these lands, the Eastern Empire, very much considered themselves to be Romans, in Roman, I should say, in terms of statehood, right up until the end. They had long since adopted Greek language, Greek customs and forms. Culturally they were Greek or Hellenic from about the 6th or 7th century onwards. It's a bit of a bone of contention, but even so it was still the Roman Empire. It was the direct successor state to the classical Roman Empire. And the reason I'm talking about it today is because today is the anniversary of a quite significant event in the very long history of the Eastern Empire. On this day in 1259, Michael VIII Palaiologos, I'm not very good at the Greek pronunciation, was crowned co-emperor with a boy, a 10-year-old boy, who was John IV Laskaris. They were crowned co-emperors, which was quite a common arrangement within the empire, had been for centuries, within Nicaea, the Empire of Nicaea, which is today comprises much of Western Turkey. Now, I'll describe the relationship between these two, Michael and John, in a later video, but I'll just give you some context to what this is all about. Now, why were Michael and John crowned co-emperors in Nicaea instead of Constantinople? Well, back in 1204, over 50 years earlier, Constantinople had been sacked by the Western armies of the Fourth Crusade. Now, the Western Crusades were supposed to be all about recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims, but what happened, for various convoluted reasons that I may go into at another time, is that instead the crusade was directed against Constantinople. Now the emperors, the Byzantine or the Eastern emperors, were Christians. They were fellow Christians, although they were Orthodox as opposed to Latin, as opposed to Western Christians. You had the Western Church centred on Rome and the papacy, and then the Eastern Church, headed by the Patriarch, the equivalent of the Pope, in Constantinople. But despite being fellow Christians, that didn't count for very much. The Crusaders stormed the city anyway. A tragic event, really. Still remembered as a real atrocity in modern-day Greece. And the city was sacked and taken over by the Westerners, or the Latins as they were called by the people of the empire. And for the next 50 or so years it was ruled by a series of Frankish or Latin emperors, while what was left of the Roman Empire, which no longer had its capital, it had lost its chief city, it fragmented into these sort of splinter states The most important of them were the Empire of Nicaea, which I said was in western Turkey, the Empire of Trebizond, which was much further to the northeast and bordered the Black Sea, and then the Despotate of Epirus, which was in Greece. Now there were sort of smaller fragmented states within this sort of great mess of this ruined empire, but these three were the most important. And while the Latin emperors ruled from Constantinople, these successor states fought the Latins to try and get territory back and ultimately get the city back, the great city as they called it, the queen of cities, Constantinople, capital of their empire. But they also fought each other, and they were fighting each other to establish who should be the main successor to the Roman Empire when the empire, if the empire was restored, who was going to be in charge of it and which of them was going to rule as the sole imperial dynasty, because you couldn't have three emperors or three or more. There could only be one ruling dynasty, and it was a case of, well, who was going to win out in the end. And these very complex internal warfares and battles went on for decades after 1204. It was a very complicated mess, as you could imagine, fascinating webs of political alliances and betrayals, as all the various factions sided with each other or betrayed each other, broke treaties and agreements all over the place, forged new alliances. But what happens in Nicaea is that you get this new dynasty rising that proves to be the most successful and capable of all the competing dynasties and families. And this is the Laskarid dynasty. The first emperor of this dynasty is Theodore I Laskaris. He started out as an imperial bodyguard in Constantinople before the city fell. But he escaped before the city was sacked by the Crusaders, and he managed to set up this empire in exile in Nicaea. And by dint of great effort, it was a heroic effort really. He's one of the sort of heroic figures of this very dark period in the history of the empire. He managed to draw all of these scattered generals and scholars and officers who had all been part of the imperial administration before Constantinople was sacked. He managed to draw many of them to Nicaea and persuade them to set up this kind of empire in exile under his rule. And he was proclaimed emperor, the one who wore the purple robes of state. Now the rulers of Trebizond and Epirus disagreed. They saw themselves as the rightful emperors. But from about 1220 onwards, really, Nicaea starts to emerge as the most powerful and important of these successor states. And if anyone is going to re-establish the Roman Empire as it was and recover the ancient capital, then it was going to be the Laskarid dynasty in Nicaea. Now Theodore was followed by John Dukas Vatatzes. They have some wonderful names, these Eastern emperors. John III Dukas Vatatzes, who was another very, very competent man, possibly the best of all of them really. And what he manages to do in his quite long reign of about 30 years is, while he fails to recover Constantinople, he recovered so much territory around the city in Anatolia and the Balkan states, what is now the Balkan states, that he manages to effectively surround the city, which sits on the Bosphorus, both sides of the Bosphorus, west and east, and cut off the Latin garrison, the Westerners who were still occupying it, from any help from Europe, from Western Europe, all the kingdoms of Western Christendom. And this means that by the mid-13th century, it really is only a matter of time before Constantinople is retaken. It's a question of who's going to do it. Now, if John Vatatzes had lived a few years longer, he might well have been the man to do it. And he would have deserved it, really, considering that he was the one who made this happen. and who recovered this really desperate, dark situation where it looked like what was left of the empire was going to crumble into these squabbling little mini-states and eventually be devoured by the Latins, by the West. Instead, he stages this very dramatic recovery, but he dies before he's able to finish the job and take the city. He's followed by his son Theodore II, who only rules for 4 years. And Theodore, a very, very interesting person, possibly the most interesting personality of these Laskarid emperors. Maybe not the most sort of stable or competent, but he was a brilliant intellectual. Many of his letters and writings survive. Possibly slightly mentally unstable. I mean, he only ruled for 4 years, and while he starts out very well, he continues his father's work of recovering lands and defeating the empire's enemies in war, particularly the Latins and the Bulgarians. Towards the end of his short reign, he started to show real signs of instability, even sort of creeping insanity. He starts to do some very erratic things, and if he had lived much longer, you have to wonder, would he have ended up as a sort of latter-day Nero or Caligula, someone like that, someone who we remember as this sort of very promising youth who unfortunately degenerated into this awful tyrant. But as it was, he died quite young, after a reign of only 4 years. And he left a young son who was John IV Laskaris, who I mentioned at the start of this video. Now, by rights, John should have been crowned sole emperor, but Michael, who is a kinsman of the Laskaris dynasty, he's related, he sort of muscles his way in. And Michael is a son of one of the old imperial aristocratic families. His father was a general, and he, from the start of his career, really is obviously a very sort of smart, gifted, very ambitious and ruthless man who has got his eyes set on the crown, on the main prize, and he's going to get it no matter what. And he manages to sort of push himself forward. He wins several victories over the Latins, which is important. Any emperor or wannabe ruler who's going to get anywhere in this very bloody, complex situation has got to be a successful soldier, military commander, and Michael is certainly that. And he sort of manoeuvres himself into this situation that by 1259, on this day in 1259, he and John are crowned co-emperors. Now, you might be thinking, well, Michael, as I've described him, is not only an adult, but he's also very sort of ambitious, grasping, ruthless, smart. John is just a child. He's 10 years old. His father's dead. What are John's chances here in this extremely tense, volatile environment where really only the sort of the toughest survive? It really is survival of the fittest. To which the inevitable answer is they're not great. His chances of survival are not great. And it does all end very badly for him, unfortunately. But having got him and Michael to this point, this important point in the history of the empire in 1259, and hopefully given a bit of context leading up to this sort of dual crowning, I'm going to leave it there and then take it forward in the next video and explain what happened next. So I hope that was enjoyable, and stay tuned. Thank you.